Hello and welcome to Night Historian. Tonight we turn our attention to the year 1204 and the events that unfolded in the Mediterranean world, a story of how economic interest reshaped religious conviction, how debt became a weapon, and how a single moment of compromise altered the course of centuries. Before we begin, I ask only this: if you find value in this work, consider supporting it. Your attention sustains these stories. I am also curious, where in the world do you listen and at what hour? Drop your location and time in the comments. I read them all. Now, let the outside world fade away, dim the lights, and let us journey together into a world where faith and commerce collided, where the sacred became negotiable, and where the currents of history flowed in directions no one anticipated. The harbour at Venice in the year 1200 hummed with the sound of commerce and calculation. Merchants moved through the narrow waterways with purpose, their boats laden with goods from distant lands, silk from the east, spices that commanded prices equal to their weight in silver, timber from forests that few Venetians had ever seen. The smell of salt water mixed with tar, rope, and the particular odour of trade goods stored in wooden holds. This was a city built on water, sustained by water, and made wealthy through the control of water. The lagoons and canals that surrounded Venice were not obstacles to be overcome, but rather the foundation of everything the city had become. The people who inhabited this world understood themselves as merchants first and Christians second, though they would never have admitted such a hierarchy aloud. They had learned over generations that neutrality was profitable. When conflicts erupted between rival powers, between the Byzantine Empire and the rising Ottoman threat, between the Papal States and secular kingdoms, between Christian and Muslim, Venice remained strategically detached. They traded with all sides. They sold weapons to both Christians and Muslims. They maintained embassies in Constantinople, Cairo, and the ports of the Levant. Their wealth did not depend on the triumph of any single faith, but rather on the continuation of trade itself, on the flow of goods and the exchange of currency. Yet in the year 1198, something shifted across the Mediterranean world. A new pope ascended to the throne of St. Peter, Innocent III, a man of unusual intelligence and ambition. He looked at the state of Christendom and saw failure. The Crusades, which had begun nearly a century earlier with such fervour and conviction, had stalled. Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands. The great kingdoms established by earlier Crusaders were crumbling. The Third Crusade, which had concluded only 6 years prior, had ended not in triumph, but in negotiation and compromise. Richard the Lionheart had achieved some victories, but the Holy City remained unconquered. The spiritual wound this created across Europe was profound. Nobles who had spent fortunes and sacrificed sons returned home without the redemption they had sought. The promise that God favoured the Christian cause seemed increasingly hollow. Pope Innocent III determined that a new crusade would be called the Fourth Crusade. This time, he decreed, it would be different. This time, the warriors of Christendom would be properly organised, properly funded, and properly directed. The call went out across Europe in the spring of 1198. Young nobles, ambitious knights, and men seeking spiritual redemption answered. They took the cross, literally sewing a cloth cross onto their garments as a symbol of their commitment. They took oaths before priests. They made arrangements to leave their estates, their families, their ordinary lives. They believed themselves to be embarking on a sacred mission, one that would restore Christian honour and reclaim the lands that God had promised to his people. The problem, however, was immediate and practical. To reach the Holy Land, these warriors needed ships, thousands of them. The Mediterranean was not a river to be forded, but a vast body of water that required vessels, navigation, and resources that individual knights could not provide. The Crusaders would need to contract with a maritime power, a city that possessed the naval capacity to transport an army across open water. There were only a few such cities in the Mediterranean world. Genoa was one, Pisa was another, but Venice was the greatest. Venice possessed not merely ships but an entire infrastructure of maritime commerce. Venice had the expertise, the resources, and the will to undertake such an enterprise. In 1201, representatives of the Crusade approached Venice with a proposal. They came as supplicants, in a sense, though they did not fully understand the position of weakness they occupied. They asked if Venice would build or provide ships sufficient to transport an army of 20,000 warriors, along with their horses, their provisions, and their equipment, across the Mediterranean to the Holy Land. They asked if Venice would do this for a price that the Crusaders could pay, or perhaps pay later, once they had conquered Jerusalem and acquired the wealth of the East. The Venetian leadership listened to this proposal with the careful attention of men who understood the mechanics of power. They saw an opportunity, but they also saw a risk. To construct or gather 50 ships capable of carrying such a force would require significant investment. The Crusaders were promising payment, but promises made by men embarking on military campaigns were notoriously unreliable. Yet the potential reward was substantial. If the Crusades succeeded, if Jerusalem fell to Christian forces, the trade routes through the Levant would be secured for Christian merchants. Venice could establish itself as the primary commercial intermediary between Europe and the East. The wealth generated would be immense. The Venetian leadership made a calculation. They would accept the contract. They would provide the ships, but they would do so on terms that protected their interests. The contract they drafted specified a price, 85,000 silver marks. This was an enormous sum, equivalent to the annual revenue of a small kingdom. The Crusaders could not pay this sum up front. They did not possess it, so Venice agreed to extend credit. The Crusaders would pay what they could when they arrived in Venice, and the remainder would be paid from the spoils of conquest in the Holy Land. But there was a condition embedded in this arrangement, a clause that would prove to be the hinge upon which history would turn. If the full payment was not made, the debt would become the personal obligation of the Crusaders themselves. Their lands, their titles, their families' futures would be forfeit. This contract, signed in 1201, represented something more than a simple commercial transaction. It represented the moment when economic leverage began to reshape the course of a religious mission. The Crusaders did not yet understand this. They believed they were simply securing transportation. They believed that once they reached the Holy Land, once they conquered Jerusalem, the payment would be easy. They did not comprehend that they had placed themselves in a position of financial dependency, that they had given Venice not merely a commercial interest in the Crusade, but a form of control over its direction and its purpose. The harbour at Venice continued its rhythms of commerce. Ships came and went, merchants calculated their profits and losses. The city's leadership met in councils and made decisions about trade, about alliances, about the future. But now, added to all the ordinary calculations of commerce, there was a new factor: the debt owed by the Crusaders, the obligation that had been created through contract and circumstance. This debt would prove to be far more powerful than any military force, far more transformative than any religious conviction. It would redirect the entire crusade. It would topple an empire. It would reshape the Mediterranean world for centuries to come. The water that surrounded Venice, the currents that had made the city wealthy, would soon carry the Crusaders not toward the Holy Land, but toward Constantinople, toward betrayal, toward a moment that would be remembered as one of the great moral catastrophes of the medieval world. But that moment had not yet arrived, for now the contracts were signed, the ships were being prepared, and the Crusaders were gathering, believing themselves to be embarking on a sacred mission. They did not yet know that the currents were already pulling them in a direction they had not chosen, toward a destination they had not intended, toward a transformation that would corrupt everything they believed themselves to represent. The Third Crusade had ended in 1192, and the men who returned to Europe carried with them a particular species of disappointment. They had marched across deserts. They had fought in battles where the sun itself seemed to conspire against them. They had lost comrades, spent fortunes, and sacrificed years of their lives. Richard the Lionheart, one of the greatest military commanders of his age, had negotiated a treaty with Saladin that allowed Christian pilgrims to visit Jerusalem, but the city itself remained under Muslim control. The cross did not fly from the walls of the Holy Sepulchre. The sacred sites remained in the hands of those whom the Church deemed infidels. For the warriors who had undertaken this crusade, the result felt like a betrayal by God himself. The spiritual crisis this created rippled across Christendom. Preachers in cathedrals struggled to explain how an army blessed by the Pope, composed of the most skilled warriors in Europe, could fail to achieve its objective. Theologians debated whether God had withdrawn his favour from the Christian cause. Nobles who had invested enormous resources in the crusade found themselves unable to justify the expenditure to their heirs. Families that had lost sons questioned whether those deaths had purchased anything of value. The certainty that had characterized the earlier crusades, the conviction that God favored Christian arms, that righteousness would triumph over infidelity, had fractured. Yet the desire to reclaim Jerusalem did not diminish. If anything, the failure of the Third Crusade intensified the longing. The Holy Land represented something more than a geographical location. It embodied the promise of redemption, the possibility of spiritual transformation through military action. For a medieval Christian, the idea that the most sacred sites of their faith remained in Muslim hands constituted an ongoing wound to Christendom itself. The very existence of this situation demanded correction. It demanded that someone at some point would gather the resources and the will to succeed where others had failed. Pope Innocent III understood this hunger. He had ascended to the papal throne in 1198 at the age of 37, younger than most of his predecessors, and possessed of an unusual combination of intellectual sophistication and political ambition. He looked at the state of Christendom and saw an opportunity. The failure of the Third Crusade had created a vacuum of religious purpose. The faithful were demoralized. The nobility was divided. But there remained beneath the surface a profound desire for redemption, for a cause that would unite Christendom and restore its spiritual authority. In the year 1198, Pope Innocent III issued a call for a new crusade. The language he employed was carefully crafted. He did not merely request that warriors take up arms. He framed the crusade as a divine imperative, a command from God himself transmitted through the Pope's authority. He promised spiritual rewards, the remission of sins, the assurance of salvation to those who took the cross. He appealed to the pride of the Christian nobility. He suggested that this crusade would succeed where others had failed, because it would be organized with greater care, funded with greater resources, and directed with greater wisdom. The response across Europe was significant. Young nobles who had heard stories of the Third Crusade from their fathers and uncles now saw an opportunity to prove themselves in a sacred cause. Men who had failed in their ambitions in Europe saw the crusade as a chance for redemption and advancement. The Church offered spiritual incentives, but there were also material incentives. A successful crusade would bring wealth. The spoils of conquered cities would be distributed among the victors. Lands in the Holy Land could be claimed and held. For ambitious men with limited prospects in Europe, the crusade represented possibility. The recruitment process began in earnest in 1199 and 1200. Preachers travelled through the countryside, preaching the crusade to peasants and nobles alike. They described the glories of Jerusalem. They spoke of the suffering of Christian pilgrims who were mistreated by Muslim rulers. They invoked the memory of earlier Crusaders who had conquered the Holy Land and established Christian kingdoms. They promised that this time, with proper organisation and adequate resources, the crusade would succeed. Young men took the cross, literally sewing cloth crosses onto their garments as a visible symbol of their commitment. They took oaths before priests. They made arrangements to leave their homes and their ordinary lives. Among those who answered the call were some of the most powerful nobles in Europe. The Count of Flanders committed himself to the crusade. The Count of Blois pledged his support. Younger sons of great houses Men who would inherit little in Europe, but who might carve out kingdoms in the East, joined the movement. The Crusade began to take on the character of a major military and political enterprise, not merely a religious undertaking, but a coordinated effort involving the highest levels of European nobility. Yet even as the Crusade was being organised, a fundamental problem became apparent. To reach the Holy Land, the Crusaders would need to cross the Mediterranean Sea. This was not a journey that could be undertaken by land. The routes overland to the Levant passed through territories controlled by hostile powers. The sea route was the only practical option, but crossing the Mediterranean required ships, many ships, capable of carrying not only warriors, but also horses, siege equipment, provisions, and supplies sufficient to sustain an army for months or years. The Crusaders who had taken the cross understood this problem intellectually, but they did not fully grasp its implications. They were accustomed to thinking in terms of military power and religious conviction. They did not naturally think in terms of logistics and commerce. They did not understand that their ability to reach the Holy Land depended entirely on their ability to secure maritime transport, and that maritime transport was controlled by a small number of wealthy cities that operated according to principles of profit and loss rather than religious conviction. Some of the Crusaders attempted to solve this problem independently. They made arrangements with various ports to hire ships. They negotiated with merchants and sea captains, but these efforts proved inadequate. The scale of the crusade was too large. The number of warriors, horses, and supplies was too great. No collection of individual merchants and sea captains could provide sufficient transport. What was needed was the coordinated resources of an entire maritime republic, a city that possessed not merely a few ships, but an entire fleet. Not merely merchants, but an organized commercial infrastructure capable of undertaking such an enormous enterprise. This realization led the Crusades' leadership to turn their attention toward Venice. Venice possessed the naval capacity that no other Christian city could match. Venice had built its entire civilization around maritime commerce. It possessed shipyards capable of constructing vessels of any size. It maintained a merchant fleet that ranged across the entire Mediterranean and beyond. It had the financial resources to undertake such an enterprise. Most importantly, Venice had the organizational capacity to coordinate such a massive logistical operation. The decision to approach Venice represented a critical moment in the Crusades' history, though those involved did not fully understand its significance at the time. By placing their dependence on Venice for maritime transport, the Crusaders were placing themselves in a position of vulnerability. They were making themselves dependent on a city that operated according to commercial logic rather than religious conviction. They were creating a relationship in which Venice would have leverage over the Crusades' direction and purpose. They did not yet comprehend that this dependence would prove to be the mechanism through which the Crusade would be redirected, corrupted, and ultimately transformed into something entirely different from what they had intended. The history of the Crusades up to this point had been a history of religious conviction attempting to impose itself on the material world. Warriors had marched across deserts, sustained by faith. Armies had fought in climates and terrain entirely foreign to them, driven by the conviction that they were executing God's will. Some had succeeded in establishing Christian kingdoms in the Levant, others had failed and perished, but throughout the fundamental motivation had remained constant: the belief that reclaiming the Holy Land was a sacred duty, that God favoured Christian arms, that righteousness would ultimately triumph. Yet the Fourth Crusade would prove to be different. It would demonstrate that religious conviction, when confronted with the hard realities of commerce and debt, could be redirected, rationalized, and ultimately abandoned. It would show that economic leverage could prove more powerful than spiritual commitment. It would reveal that the machinery of the crusade, the organization, the funding, the logistics, could be captured and repurposed by those who controlled its material foundations. Venice understood this, even if the Crusaders did not. Venice understood that whoever controlled the ships controlled the crusade. Whoever controlled the crusade could direct it toward objectives that served Venice's interests rather than Christendom's spiritual aspirations. The failure of the Third Crusade had created a hunger for redemption. Pope Innocent III had channeled this hunger into a call for a new crusade. The nobility of Europe had answered this call with genuine conviction and commitment. But the material requirements of the crusade, the need for ships, for transport, for logistical support, created dependencies that would prove to be fatal to the crusade's original purpose. The warriors who took the cross believed themselves to be embarking on a sacred mission. They did not understand that they were about to become instruments of Venetian commercial policy, that their religious conviction would be subordinated to economic calculation, that the currents of history were already pulling them toward a destination they had not chosen and would not have chosen had they understood what awaited them. In the year 1201, representatives of the Crusade travelled to Venice to negotiate the terms of maritime transport. They arrived as men accustomed to authority and respect. They were counts and nobles, men who commanded armies and controlled vast territories in Europe. Yet in Venice they encountered a different form of power, not the power of military might or hereditary rank, but the power of capital, organization, and commercial sophistication. The Venetian leadership received them in the Doge's palace, a structure that itself embodied the city's wealth and confidence. The Doge, the elected chief magistrate of Venice, listened to the Crusaders' proposal with the careful attention of a man who understood that this negotiation could reshape his city's future. The Crusaders explained their need. They required transport for approximately 20,000 warriors, along with horses, siege equipment, provisions, and supplies. They needed ships capable of crossing the Mediterranean and landing on hostile shores. They needed the logistical support to sustain an army during a prolonged military campaign. The Venetian leadership did not refuse this request. Instead, they saw in it an opportunity of extraordinary magnitude. If Venice could provide transport for a crusade of this scale, if the crusade succeeded in conquering the Holy Land, the commercial implications would be immense. Venice would establish itself as the primary intermediary between Europe and the East. The trade routes through the Levant would be secured for Christian merchants. The wealth generated through commerce would flow through Venetian hands. The city's already considerable power would increase exponentially. Yet Venice's leadership also understood the risks involved. To construct or gather 50 ships capable of carrying such a force would require substantial investment. The shipyards would need to work at capacity, materials would need to be acquired, labour would need to be hired and paid. The opportunity cost was significant. Resources devoted to this enterprise could not be devoted to other commercial ventures. Furthermore, the Crusaders were promising payment, but promises made by men embarking on military campaigns were notoriously unreliable. Military campaigns frequently failed. Warriors were killed. Armies were defeated. If the crusade failed to reach the Holy Land, if it failed to conquer Jerusalem, if it failed to acquire the wealth necessary to pay for transport, Venice would find itself holding a massive debt with no means of collection. The Venetian negotiators approached this problem with the pragmatism of experienced merchants. They would accept the contract, but they would structure it in a way that protected Venice's interests. The price they set for transport was 85,000 silver marks. This figure was not arbitrary. It represented a calculation of the actual costs of constructing and provisioning the ships, plus a substantial profit margin. It represented what Venice believed the market would bear. It represented, in essence, what Venice believed the crusade could afford to pay. The problem, however, became immediately apparent. The Crusaders did not possess 85,000 silver marks. They could not pay this sum up front. The nobles who had taken the cross had committed their resources to the crusade, but their resources were not liquid. Their wealth consisted of land, titles, and feudal obligations, things that could not be quickly converted into currency. The Crusaders could contribute what they possessed, but it would fall short of the total amount Venice demanded. This created a negotiating impasse. Venice would not reduce its price significantly. The profit margin was essential to justify the investment. The Crusaders could not pay the full amount up front. Yet both parties had an interest in reaching an agreement. The Crusaders needed the ships, Venice needed the profit and the commercial opportunities that a successful crusade would generate. The solution they arrived at involved extending credit. Venice agreed to provide the ships and supplies. The Crusaders would pay what they could when they arrived in Venice, a down payment that would demonstrate their commitment and provide Venice with some immediate return on its investment. The remainder of the debt would be paid from the spoils of conquest in the Holy Land. Once the Crusaders had conquered Jerusalem and the surrounding territories, they would have access to the wealth of the East. From this wealth, they would pay Venice the outstanding balance. This arrangement seemed reasonable to both parties, though for different reasons. The Crusaders believed that once they conquered the Holy Land, acquiring the necessary funds would be straightforward. They would plunder the cities they conquered. They would seize the treasures of Muslim rulers. They would control the trade routes and tax the commerce that flowed through them. Paying Venice would be a manageable expense in the context of the vast wealth they anticipated acquiring. Venice's leadership, however, understood something that the Crusaders did not fully grasp. They understood that extending credit created leverage. By making the crusade dependent on Venetian financing, Venice had created a mechanism through which it could influence the crusade's direction and objectives. If the Crusaders attempted to deviate from paths that served Venice's interests, Venice could threaten to withhold supplies, to refuse to provide additional transport, or to demand immediate payment of the outstanding debt. The contract that the two parties signed in 1201 contained a clause that made this leverage explicit. If the Crusaders failed to pay the full amount owed, the debt would become a personal obligation of the Crusaders themselves. Their lands, their titles, their families' futures would be forfeit to Venice. This clause transformed the nature of the relationship between Venice and the Crusade. It was no longer simply a commercial transaction between two parties with aligned interests. It became a relationship in which one party held the other in a form of financial bondage. The Crusaders had mortgaged their futures to Venice. They had placed themselves in a position where failure to pay would result in the loss of everything they possessed. This created an extraordinary form of pressure. The Crusaders could not afford to fail. They could not afford to return to Europe without having paid Venice. They could not afford to pursue objectives that did not serve Venice's commercial interests, because doing so might jeopardize their ability to acquire the wealth necessary to pay their debt. Venice's financial situation at this time was itself more complex than the Crusaders understood. Venice was wealthy, certainly, but it was not infinitely wealthy. The city had experienced economic pressures in recent years. Competition from Genoa and other maritime republics had intensified. Trade routes had been disrupted by political instability in the Mediterranean. Venice's leadership understood that the crusade represented a significant financial risk, but it also represented a potential solution to some of Venice's economic challenges. If the crusade succeeded, if Venice could establish itself as the primary commercial intermediary in the Levant, the city's economic position would be secured for decades to come. The contract negotiated between Venice and the Crusade in 1201 represented, in many respects, a gamble on Venice's part. The city was investing substantial resources in an enterprise whose success was far from guaranteed. Military campaigns frequently failed, armies were defeated, warriors died. The crusade might never reach the Holy Land. It might be destroyed en route. It might reach the Holy Land and fail to conquer it. In any of these scenarios, Venice would lose its investment. The city would be left holding a debt owed by men who had no means of paying it. Yet Venice's leadership made this gamble deliberately. They understood that the potential rewards justified the risks. They understood that if the Crusades succeeded, the commercial opportunities would be extraordinary. They understood that by extending credit to the Crusade, they were not merely providing a service but rather positioning themselves to capture the benefits of the Crusade's success. They understood, in other words, that money could be a form of power, that by controlling the financing of the Crusade, they could influence its direction and its objectives. The Crusaders who signed this contract did not fully comprehend what they were committing themselves to. They understood that they were incurring a debt, certainly, but they believed this debt was manageable. They believed that once they conquered the Holy Land, they would have access to sufficient wealth to pay it. They did not understand that they were placing themselves in a position of dependency, that they were giving Venice not merely a commercial interest in the Crusade, but a form of control over its direction and purpose. They did not understand that the debt they had incurred would prove to be more powerful than any military force, that it would reshape the Crusade in ways they could not anticipate. The ships began to be constructed in the Venetian shipyards. The work proceeded through 1201 and into 1202. Carpenters shaped timber into hulls, sailmakers stitched canvas into sails, rope makers twisted fibres into cordage. The entire productive capacity of Venice's maritime industry was directed toward this single enterprise. The city hummed with activity. Resources that might have been devoted to other commercial ventures were instead devoted to building the vessels that would carry the Crusade to the Holy Land. Meanwhile, Crusaders from across Europe began to gather in Venice, preparing for their departure. They arrived in groups and contingents, bringing with them the resources they had managed to assemble. Some brought money, others brought goods that could be sold to raise money. Some brought nothing but their commitment and their hope that the Crusade would provide them with the wealth and status they sought. The city of Venice, accustomed to commerce and calculation, suddenly found itself hosting an army of religious warriors, men who spoke different languages, who came from different regions of Europe, who were united by religious conviction, but divided by regional loyalties and personal ambitions. The contrast between the Venetian merchants and the Crusaders was stark. The merchants thought in terms of profit and loss, of risk and return, of commercial advantage and competitive position. The Crusaders thought in terms of religious duty, of spiritual redemption, of the sacred mission to reclaim the Holy Land. The merchants calculated the financial implications of various courses of action. The Crusaders prayed and sought guidance from priests and bishops. The merchants understood that money could be a weapon. The Crusaders believed that faith could move mountains. Yet these two groups were now bound together by the contract they had signed. Venice needed the Crusade to succeed, because a successful crusade would generate the wealth necessary to pay the debt. The Crusaders needed Venice's ships, because without them they could not reach the Holy Land. Each party had leverage over the other, but Venice's leverage was more concrete, more immediate, more enforceable. Venice could withhold supplies. Venice could refuse to provide transport. Venice could demand payment of the outstanding debt. The Crusaders, by contrast, could only threaten to abandon the crusade, and such a threat would result in the loss of everything they had invested. The debt that Venice had created through the contract of 1201 was not merely a financial obligation. It was a mechanism of control. It was a way of binding the crusade to Venice's interests. It was a way of ensuring that the crusade would pursue objectives that served Venice's commercial ambitions, even if those objectives diverged from the Crusade's original spiritual purpose. The Crusaders did not yet understand this. They believed themselves to be embarking on a sacred mission, sustained by faith and guided by divine providence. They did not understand that they had already been captured, that the currents of history had already begun to pull them in a direction they had not chosen, that the debt they had incurred would prove to be more determinative of their fate than any military strategy or religious conviction. By the spring of 1202, the Crusaders began to arrive in Venice in earnest. They came in contingents, travelling overland through Europe and then down the Italian peninsula to reach the lagoon city. The Count of Flanders arrived with his retinue. The Count of Blois brought his forces. Younger sons of great houses, ambitious knights, and men seeking redemption through military action converged on Venice. The city, accustomed to commerce and calculation, suddenly found itself hosting an army of religious warriors whose presence disrupted the ordinary rhythms of trade and daily life. Yet as the Crusaders gathered, a critical problem emerged. The number of warriors who actually arrived in Venice fell significantly short of the 20,000 that had been anticipated when the contract was negotiated. Some Crusaders had taken alternative routes to the Holy Land, travelling overland through Europe and the Mediterranean rather than waiting for Venetian transport. Others had decided not to participate in the Crusade at all, having reconsidered their commitment or encountered financial difficulties. Still, others had died en route or abandoned the enterprise. The result was that only approximately 12,000 warriors assembled in Venice rather than the 20,000 the contract had anticipated. This discrepancy created an immediate financial crisis. The Crusaders had committed to paying 85,000 silver marks for transport of 20,000 warriors. The actual number of warriors present was substantially smaller. By the logic of simple mathematics, the Crusaders should have owed proportionally less. Yet Venice did not reduce its price. The city's leadership argued that the contract specified a total price for the entire enterprise, not a per-warrior cost. The ships had been constructed, the supplies had been gathered, the logistical infrastructure had been established. These costs did not diminish simply because fewer warriors had arrived. The Crusaders found themselves in an impossible position. They could not pay the full amount owed. The resources they had assembled fell short of what Venice demanded. The down payment they had brought with them covered only a portion of the debt. They faced a choice: either find a way to raise the additional funds or abandon the crusade entirely. Abandoning the crusade was not a realistic option for most of them. They had committed themselves publicly. They had taken oaths before priests. They had made arrangements to leave their homes and families. To return to Europe without having reached the Holy Land would result in shame, humiliation, and the loss of everything they had invested in the enterprise. Venice's leadership, observing the Crusaders' desperation, recognized an opportunity. The city's negotiators approached the Crusaders with a proposal. Venice would forgive a portion of the outstanding debt if the Crusaders would undertake a military campaign on Venice's behalf. Specifically, Venice wanted the Crusaders to help recapture the city of Zara, a port city on the Dalmatian coast that had recently fallen under the control of the King of Hungary. Zara had once been a Venetian possession, and its loss represented both an economic loss and a blow to Venice's prestige. If the Crusaders would help Venice recapture Zara, Venice would reduce the outstanding debt by an amount equivalent to the value of the military service rendered. This proposal placed the Crusaders in an extraordinary moral and practical dilemma. Zara was a Christian city. The King of Hungary who controlled it was a Christian ruler. The Crusade had been called to fight against Muslim infidels in the Holy Land, not to wage war against fellow Christians. The Pope himself had explicitly forbidden the Crusaders from attacking Christian territories. To attack Zara would be to violate a direct papal command. It would be to transform the Crusade from a religious mission into a mercenary enterprise, to convert the warriors of Christendom into hired soldiers serving Venice's commercial interests. Yet the Crusaders faced a choice that seemed to have no good option. They could refuse Venice's proposal, maintain their commitment to the original Crusade objective, and find themselves unable to pay their debt. In this scenario, they would lose everything. Their lands, their titles, their families' futures would be forfeit to Venice. Alternatively, they could accept Venice's proposal, attack Zara, reduce their debt, and continue toward the Holy Land. This option involved violating papal authority and attacking fellow Christians, but it would allow them to preserve their ability to continue the crusade. The internal debates among the Crusaders' leadership were intense. Some argued passionately that attacking Zara would be a betrayal of everything the crusade represented. They invoked the Pope's explicit prohibition. They argued that God would not favour a crusade that began by attacking Christians. They insisted that the Crusaders should refuse Venice's proposal, even if it meant abandoning the enterprise. Others, however, argued that the debt situation was untenable, that without reducing the outstanding amount owed to Venice, the crusade could not proceed to the Holy Land. They suggested that attacking Zara, while regrettable, was a necessary evil, a temporary deviation from the crusade's true purpose that would allow the enterprise to continue. The rationalization process that occurred among the Crusaders' leadership during this period reveals something important about how human beings justify moral compromises. The Crusaders did not frame their decision to attack Zara as a betrayal of their religious mission. Instead, they constructed narratives that allowed them to understand the attack as consistent with, or even required by, their commitment to the crusade. They argued that Venice's cooperation was essential to the crusade's success. They suggested that without Venice's ships, the crusade could not proceed at all. Therefore, they reasoned, maintaining good relations with Venice, even if it meant attacking a Christian city, was actually necessary to preserve the Crusade's ultimate objective of reclaiming the Holy Land. Furthermore, the Crusaders' leadership invoked theological arguments to justify the attack on Zara. They noted that the King of Hungary had not been a faithful ally to Christendom. They suggested that Zara, having fallen under Hungarian control, had become corrupted and needed to be reclaimed by true Christians. They argued that the attack on Zara was, in a sense, a preliminary campaign that would strengthen Christendom's position in the Mediterranean and thereby facilitate the later conquest of the Holy Land. These arguments were, in many respects, transparent rationalizations, yet they served their purpose. They allowed the Crusaders to frame their decision to attack Zara as consistent with their religious mission, rather than as a betrayal of it. The Crusaders' decision to accept Venice's proposal and attack Zara represented a critical moment in the history of the Fourth Crusade. It was the first major deviation from the Crusade's original objective. It was the first time that the Crusaders allowed economic pressure to override religious conviction. It was the first time that the debt Venice had created through the contract of 1201 actually shaped the Crusade's direction and objectives. Yet it would not be the last. In the autumn of 1202, the Crusader fleet sailed from Venice towards Zara. The warriors who had taken the cross to reclaim the Holy Land now found themselves engaged in a military campaign to capture a Christian city on behalf of a commercial republic. The attack on Zara succeeded. The city fell to the combined forces of the Crusaders and Venetian troops. The King of Hungary's forces were defeated and expelled. Zara returned to Venetian control. Yet the attack on Zara created profound consequences that extended far beyond the immediate military victory. Pope Innocent III, learning of the Crusaders' attack on a Christian city in violation of his explicit prohibition, responded with fury. He issued a decree of excommunication against the Crusaders. The warriors who had taken the cross, believing themselves to be executing God's will, now found themselves cast out of the church. They were denied the sacraments. They were excluded from Christian burial. They were, in the eyes of the church, damned. The excommunication created a spiritual crisis among the Crusaders. Many of them had embarked on the Crusades specifically to achieve spiritual redemption, to have their sins forgiven through participation in a holy war. The Pope's excommunication negated this possibility. It suggested that instead of achieving redemption, they had incurred damnation. Some Crusaders abandoned the enterprise at this point, unwilling to continue under the burden of excommunication. Others, however, remained committed to the crusade, rationalizing that the Pope's prohibition was unjust or that circumstances had forced them to violate his command. The Crusaders' decision to attack Zara despite the Pope's prohibition revealed something crucial about the nature of their commitment to the crusade. Their religious conviction, it turned out, was not absolute. It could be overridden by practical considerations. It could be subordinated to economic pressure. It could be rationalized away when circumstances demanded. The Crusaders had believed themselves to be warriors of faith, executing God's will, Yet when confronted with the choice between maintaining their religious integrity and preserving their ability to continue the crusade, they had chosen the latter. They had allowed economic pressure to reshape their understanding of what the crusade represented and what actions it justified. Venice's leadership observed these developments with satisfaction. The attack on Zara had served its purpose. It had reduced the Crusaders' debt and demonstrated Venice's ability to direct the crusade toward objectives that served Venice's interests. It had also revealed something important about the Crusaders. They could be manipulated. They could be pressured into actions they would not have chosen freely. They could be made to rationalize moral compromises. Venice's leadership understood that this pattern could be repeated. If the Crusaders could be pressured into attacking Zara, they could be pressured into other actions as well. In the months following the capture of Zara, Venice's leadership began to develop a new proposal for the crusade. They had learned that the Byzantine Emperor Alexios III had recently been deposed by his nephew, Alexios IV. The deposed emperor had fled to the west and was seeking support to reclaim his throne. Venice's negotiators approached the Crusaders with a new proposition. If the Crusaders would help restore Alexios IV to the Byzantine throne, the restored emperor would provide substantial financial support to the crusade. He would pay the Crusaders directly. He would also grant Venice valuable trading privileges and territorial concessions in Byzantine territories. The Crusaders' leadership considered this proposal carefully. On its surface, it seemed to offer a solution to their financial problems. The Byzantine emperor's payment would allow them to settle their debt with Venice and continue toward the Holy Land with adequate resources. Furthermore, the proposal could be framed in religious terms. The Byzantine Empire, while schismatic in its religious practices, was still technically Christian. Restoring a Christian emperor to the throne could be presented as a Christian mission, even if it was not a direct attack on Muslim territories. Yet this proposal represented a far more radical deviation from the Crusade's original objective than the attack on Zara. Zara, at least, was on the way to the Holy Land. Constantinople was in the opposite direction. To sail to Constantinople would mean abandoning any pretense of heading toward the Holy Land in the near term. It would mean subordinating the Crusade's original religious mission entirely to Venice's commercial interests and the Byzantine succession dispute. Some Crusaders recognized this and protested vehemently. They argued that the Crusade had been called to reclaim the Holy Land, not to intervene in Byzantine politics. They insisted that attacking Constantinople, even to restore a Christian emperor, would be a betrayal of everything the Crusade represented. They urged the Crusaders' leadership to refuse Venice's proposal and instead proceed directly to the Holy Land. Yet the Crusaders' leadership, having already compromised their principles by attacking Zara, found it easier to compromise again. They rationalized that the Byzantine emperor's support would strengthen the Crusade's ability to ultimately succeed in the Holy Land. They argued that a Christian empire allied with the Crusade would provide logistical support and military assistance. They suggested that the attack on Constantinople was not truly a deviation from the Crusade's purpose, but rather a preliminary campaign that would ultimately serve the Crusade's true objective. These rationalizations were, in many respects, even more transparent than those that had justified the attack on Zara. Yet they served their purpose. They allowed the Crusaders' leadership to frame the decision to sail toward Constantinople as consistent with the Crusade's religious mission. They allowed warriors who had taken the cross to reclaim the Holy Land to convince themselves that they were still executing a sacred mission, even as they prepared to attack the greatest Christian city in the world. The decision to sail toward Constantinople represented the final step in the transformation of the Crusade. What had begun as a religious mission to reclaim the Holy Land had been progressively redirected by Venice's economic leverage. The attack on Zara had been the first major deviation. The decision to sail toward Constantinople was the second. Yet this second deviation was far more significant than the first. It represented the complete subordination of the Crusade's original religious purpose to Venice's commercial interests. It represented the moment when the Crusade ceased to be a religious enterprise and became instead an instrument of Venetian policy. The Crusaders did not fully understand this transformation. They believed themselves to be adapting to circumstances, making pragmatic adjustments to their plans while maintaining their fundamental commitment to the Crusade's religious purpose. They did not understand that they had been captured, that the currents of history had redirected them entirely, that the debt they had incurred to Venice had proven to be more powerful than any religious conviction. They did not understand that they were no longer warriors of faith, but rather soldiers of commerce, instruments through which Venice would reshape the Mediterranean world to serve its own interests. The Crusader fleet departed from Zara in the spring of 1203, sailing not toward the Holy Land, but toward Constantinople. The warriors aboard the ships understood that they were embarking on a campaign to restore a Byzantine emperor to his throne. But many of them did not fully comprehend what this meant. Constantinople was the greatest Christian city in the world, the capital of an empire that had endured for nearly 9 centuries. Its walls were legendary, its wealth was immense, its population numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The city had withstood countless sieges and attacks. It had survived invasions from barbarians, from Muslims, from rival Christian powers. The idea that 12,000 Crusaders could successfully assault such a fortress seemed, to many observers, absurd. Yet the Crusaders' leadership had received assurances from the deposed Byzantine Emperor that the city would welcome them. They had been told that the population would rise up to support the restoration of their rightful ruler. They had been promised that the assault would be brief, that resistance would be minimal, that the city would fall quickly to their superior military skill and organization. These assurances proved to be entirely false. The population of Constantinople did not rise up in support of the deposed emperor. The defenders of the city prepared to resist the Crusader assault with determination and skill. The first assault on Constantinople occurred in the summer of 1203. The Crusaders and Venetian forces attacked the city's walls from the sea, attempting to breach the defences and enter the city. The defenders, however, repelled the initial attacks. The Crusaders suffered significant casualties. The assault stalled. For weeks, the Crusader forces remained encamped outside the city, unable to penetrate its defences, unable to achieve the quick victory they had anticipated. The situation deteriorated as the summer progressed. The Crusaders' supplies began to run low. Disease spread through their encampment. Morale declined. Some Crusaders began to question whether the entire enterprise had been a mistake, whether they should abandon the assault on Constantinople and attempt to reach the Holy Land by other means. The leadership faced a crisis. The promised quick victory had not materialized. The assurances they had received from the Byzantine Emperor had proven worthless. The Crusaders were trapped outside a city they could not conquer, with supplies that were running out, and morale that was collapsing. Yet the Venetian leadership refused to abandon the enterprise. They understood that Constantinople represented an opportunity of extraordinary magnitude. The city contained treasures beyond calculation. Its control would give Venice access to the trade routes of the Black Sea and the Eastern Mediterranean. Its conquest would establish Venice as the dominant commercial power in the region for generations to come. The Venetian negotiators pressured the Crusaders' leadership to continue the assault, to maintain the siege, to find a way to breach the city's defences. The turning point came when the Crusaders and Venetians discovered a weakness in the city's defences. The sea walls on the Golden Horn, the inlet that formed the city's northern boundary, were less heavily fortified than the main walls facing the sea. The Venetian fleet, with its superior seamanship and naval expertise, manoeuvred into the Golden Horn and launched an assault on these weaker defences. The Crusaders, coordinating with the Venetian attack, pressed their assault on the main walls. The defenders of Constantinople, facing coordinated attacks from multiple directions, began to lose ground. The Crusaders breached the walls, they poured into the city, the defenders retreated. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios III, recognizing that the city was lost, abandoned Constantinople and fled. The Crusaders and Venetians entered the city in triumph. The assault that had seemed impossible only weeks earlier had succeeded, yet the moment of military victory quickly transformed into something far darker. The Crusaders, having breached the city's defences and entered its streets, encountered no organised resistance. The population of Constantinople was largely defenceless. What followed was not a military campaign, but rather a systematic campaign of plunder and destruction. The Crusaders moved through the city, looting buildings, seizing treasures, desecrating churches. They killed civilians indiscriminately. They burned buildings. They destroyed works of art and architecture that had survived for centuries. The violence that occurred during the sack of Constantinople in 1204 was not the violence of soldiers fighting against armed opponents. It was the violence of conquerors against a helpless population. It was the violence of men who had been promised wealth and who now seized it through force. It was the violence of religious warriors who had rationalized their mission so thoroughly that they could justify any action, no matter how brutal or immoral. The Crusaders' treatment of Constantinople's religious sites revealed the depth of their moral corruption. Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in Christendom, the structure that had stood as a symbol of Christian civilization for nearly 9 centuries, became a target for plunder and desecration. Crusaders entered the church and systematically stripped it of its treasures. They tore down the silver iconostasis, the screen that stood before the altar. They removed the golden vessels used in religious services. They destroyed icons and religious artwork. Some accounts describe Crusaders using the altar as a table upon which to carve meat. Some describe them urinating in the sacred spaces. Some describe them placing prostitutes on the patriarch's throne and forcing them to sing obscene songs. Whether all of these accounts are literally accurate remains a matter of historical debate. Some medieval chroniclers exaggerated atrocities to make their narratives more dramatic. Some accounts were written by those hostile to the Crusaders and may have included invented details designed to condemn them. Yet the fundamental reality is beyond dispute. The Crusaders desecrated Hagia Sophia and treated it with profound disrespect. They violated the most sacred Christian site in the Eastern Mediterranean. They transformed a church into a warehouse for plunder. The Venetian forces, meanwhile, engaged in their own systematic campaign of looting. The Venetians approached the conquest of Constantinople with the mentality of merchants rather than warriors. They were not interested in conquest for its own sake, or in the satisfaction of military victory. They were interested in wealth. They systematically identified the most valuable treasures in the city and seized them. Venetian sailors loaded ships with bronze horses, golden vessels, religious relics, and artwork. They stripped the city of its portable wealth with methodical efficiency. Among the treasures seized by the Venetians were the 4 bronze horses that had stood in the hippodrome of Constantinople. These horses, which had originally been created in ancient times and had stood as symbols of the city's power and glory, were loaded onto Venetian ships and transported back to Venice. They would eventually be installed on the facade of the Basilica di San Marco, where they remain to this day. The theft of these horses symbolized the complete subordination of Constantinople to Venetian interests. The greatest treasures of the conquered city were not distributed among the Crusaders or used to establish a new Christian kingdom. They were seized by Venice and transported to Venice, where they would serve as monuments to Venetian power and wealth. The 3 days of plunder that followed the Crusaders' breach of Constantinople's walls resulted in the destruction of incalculable wealth and cultural heritage. Buildings that had stood for centuries were burned. Manuscripts containing knowledge accumulated over generations were destroyed. Artworks of extraordinary beauty and historical significance were either stolen or destroyed. The city that had been the center of Christian civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean was systematically dismantled and its treasures distributed among the conquerors. The Crusaders, who had embarked on this enterprise, believing themselves to be warriors of faith, had transformed themselves into plunderers and destroyers. They had begun with the stated objective of reclaiming the Holy Land for Christendom. They had been redirected by Venice's economic leverage toward the attack on Zara. They had been further redirected toward the assault on Constantinople. Now, having conquered the greatest Christian city in the world, they found themselves engaged in the systematic destruction and plundering of that city. The transformation from religious warriors to mercenary soldiers to common plunderers had been completed. The establishment of a Latin empire in Constantinople following the conquest represented the final stage of this transformation. The Crusaders and Venetians divided the conquered territories among themselves. A Latin emperor was installed on the Byzantine throne. Venice received 1/4 of Constantinople itself, plus 3/8 of all conquered territories. This arrangement, known as the 3/8 rule, ensured that Venice would emerge as the primary beneficiary of the conquest. Venice acquired control of key trading posts throughout the Byzantine territories. Venice secured access to the trade routes of the Black Sea and the Eastern Mediterranean. Venice transformed itself from a wealthy Mediterranean republic into the dominant commercial power in the region. The Crusaders, meanwhile, received territories and titles in the conquered lands. Some established themselves as feudal lords in the territories they had conquered. Others returned to Europe with the treasures they had seized. Yet the fundamental reality was that the Crusade had been captured by Venice. The religious mission had been subordinated to commercial interests. The warriors of faith had become instruments of Venetian policy. Historians continue to debate the extent of the atrocities committed during the sack of Constantinople. Some medieval sources describe horrors so extreme that modern scholars question whether they represent literal truth or rhetorical exaggeration. Yet the fundamental reality is not in dispute. The Crusaders conquered Constantinople. They plundered the city systematically. They desecrated its religious sites. They destroyed cultural treasures of immeasurable value. They transformed a Christian city into a conquered territory to be exploited for profit. The sack of Constantinople in 1204 represents one of the great moral catastrophes of medieval history. A crusade that had been called to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control ended instead with the conquest and plundering of the greatest Christian city in the world. A religious mission sustained by faith and conviction was transformed into a mercenary enterprise sustained by greed and the pursuit of wealth. Warriors who had taken the cross believing themselves to be executing God's will instead became instruments of commercial policy. Their actions directed not by religious conviction, but by the economic interests of a merchant republic. The moment of the Crusaders' entry into Constantinople represented the culmination of a process that had begun with the contract negotiated between Venice and the Crusade in 1201. The debt that Venice had created through that contract had proven to be more powerful than any religious conviction. It had redirected the Crusade from its original objective. It had pressured the Crusaders into attacking fellow Christians. It had ultimately transformed the Crusade into an instrument of Venetian conquest. The currents of history, set in motion by economic calculation and financial leverage, had carried the Crusaders to a destination they had not chosen and would not have chosen had they understood what awaited them. The establishment of the Latin Empire in 1204 marked the beginning of a new era in Mediterranean history, though few who lived through these events understood the magnitude of what had occurred. The conquest of Constantinople had not been merely a military victory. It represented a fundamental restructuring of power in the Eastern Mediterranean. The Byzantine Empire, which had endured for nearly 9 centuries, and which had served as the primary guardian of Christian civilization in the East, had been shattered. In its place stood a Latin Empire controlled by Crusaders and Venetians, an entity that would prove to be far more fragile and far less capable of defending Christian interests against the rising power of the Ottoman Turks. Venice emerged from the conquest as the primary beneficiary. The 3/8 rule that had been established in the division of conquered territories gave Venice control of 1/4 of Constantinople itself, plus 3/8 of all other conquered lands. More importantly, Venice secured control of the key trading posts and harbours throughout the Byzantine territories. The city acquired Crete, the Ionian Islands, and numerous ports along the coasts of Greece and the Levant. These acquisitions transformed Venice from a wealthy Mediterranean republic into a maritime empire that controlled the crucial trade routes connecting Europe to the east. The economic implications of Venice's new position were extraordinary. The spice trade, which had previously flowed through Byzantine intermediaries and Muslim-controlled ports, now flowed through Venetian-controlled territories. The silk trade, the trade in precious metals, the trade in exotic goods from the Far East, all of these now passed through Venetian hands. Venetian merchants established themselves in the conquered territories. Venetian trading posts proliferated. Venetian ships carried goods throughout the Mediterranean and beyond. The wealth that flowed into Venice as a result of this commercial dominance was immense. The transformation of Venice's economic position had profound consequences for the city's political and military power. Venice used its newfound wealth to construct an even more formidable navy. The city built new shipyards and expanded existing ones. It recruited and trained sailors and naval commanders. It established a network of naval bases throughout the Mediterranean. Within a few decades of the conquest of Constantinople, Venice possessed a navy that was unmatched in the Mediterranean world. No other power could challenge Venetian naval supremacy. No other city could compete with Venice's ability to project power across the sea. This naval dominance translated into commercial dominance. Venetian merchants could transport goods safely across the Mediterranean, protected by Venetian warships. Rival merchants from other cities faced the choice of either paying Venetian merchants for protection or risking their ships to piracy and attack. Gradually, the trade of the Mediterranean came to be dominated by Venetian merchants. Venetian trading houses established themselves in ports throughout the region. Venetian currency became the standard medium of exchange. Venetian commercial law became the model for other Mediterranean cities. The conquest of Constantinople also had profound consequences for the religious landscape of the Mediterranean world. The Byzantine Empire had been the primary defender of Orthodox Christianity in the Eastern Mediterranean. The Orthodox Church had maintained its independence from Rome, and the Byzantine emperors had served as the protectors of Orthodox Christianity. The conquest of Constantinople by Latin Crusaders and the establishment of a Latin Empire represented a direct assault on Orthodox Christianity. The Latin conquerors imposed the Catholic Church on the conquered territories. Orthodox churches were converted to Catholic use. Orthodox priests were displaced by Catholic clergy. The religious unity of the Eastern Mediterranean, already fractured by the schism between Eastern and Western Christianity, was further damaged. The imposition of Catholic Christianity on Orthodox territories created lasting resentment among the Orthodox population. The Orthodox Christians of Constantinople and the surrounding territories did not welcome Latin rule. They did not accept the replacement of Orthodox Christianity with Catholicism. They viewed the conquest as a betrayal by fellow Christians, a violation of the bonds of faith that should have united all Christians against their Muslim enemies. This resentment would persist for centuries. When the Ottoman Turks eventually conquered Constantinople in 1453, many Orthodox Christians preferred Ottoman rule to Latin Christian rule, viewing the Ottomans as less hostile to their faith than the Catholic Church had been. The Latin Empire that was established in Constantinople proved to be far less stable and far less capable than the Byzantine Empire it had replaced. The Latin emperors lacked the administrative experience and the institutional knowledge that the Byzantine emperors had accumulated over centuries. The Latin conquerors attempted to impose feudal systems of governance on territories that had been governed through Byzantine bureaucratic structures for nearly 1,000 years. The result was administrative chaos. The Latin Empire never achieved the stability or the effectiveness of the Byzantine Empire. It remained throughout its existence dependent on Venetian military support to maintain its position. The fragmentation of Byzantine territories following the conquest created opportunities for rival powers to expand their influence in the eastern Mediterranean. The Ottoman Turks, who had been gradually expanding their power in Anatolia, accelerated their expansion following the collapse of Byzantine authority. The Serbian Empire expanded into the Balkans. The Genoese, Venice's great commercial rival, established their own trading posts and commercial networks in the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean world, that had been dominated by a single Byzantine empire, became a region of competing powers and fragmented authority. Yet Venice's position remained secure. The city's control of key trading posts and harbours, combined with its naval supremacy, allowed it to maintain its commercial dominance, despite the political fragmentation occurring around it. Venetian merchants prospered. Venetian trading houses accumulated wealth. Venetian families established themselves as the ruling elite of the Mediterranean commercial world. The conquest of Constantinople had transformed Venice from a wealthy city into a commercial empire. The debt that Venice had extended to the Crusade in 1201 had proven to be an extraordinarily profitable investment. The consequences of the Fourth Crusade extended far beyond the immediate political and commercial transformations of the Mediterranean world. The conquest of Constantinople and the establishment of the Latin Empire represented a fundamental shift in the balance of power between Christian and Muslim forces in the eastern Mediterranean. The Byzantine Empire, despite its decline, had remained a significant military and political power capable of resisting Ottoman expansion. The Latin Empire, by contrast, was far weaker and far less capable of defending Christian interests against Muslim powers. The weakening of Christian power in the eastern Mediterranean that resulted from the Fourth Crusade had profound consequences for the subsequent history of the region. The Ottoman Turks, encountering a fragmented and weakened Christian world, were able to expand their power far more rapidly than they might have otherwise. The conquest of Constantinople by the Ottomans in 1453, which is often cited as marking the end of the medieval period, might have occurred far later or might not have occurred at all had the Byzantine Empire not been shattered by the Fourth Crusade 2.5 centuries earlier. The religious consequences of the Fourth Crusade were equally profound. The conquest of Constantinople and the imposition of Catholic Christianity on Orthodox territories deepened the schism between Eastern and Western Christianity. The Orthodox Church viewed the conquest as a betrayal by fellow Christians. The Catholic Church viewed the conquest as an opportunity to extend its authority over Orthodox territories. The result was a deepening of religious divisions that would persist for centuries. The unity of Christendom, already fractured by theological disputes and political rivalries, was further damaged by the Fourth Crusade. The moral consequences of the Fourth Crusade were perhaps the most significant of all. The Crusade had begun as a religious mission to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control. It had ended with the conquest and plundering of the greatest Christian city in the world. The warriors who had taken the cross believing themselves to be executing God's will had instead become plunderers and destroyers. The religious authority of the Crusades, already damaged by the failure of the Third Crusade, was further undermined by the Fourth Crusade. Subsequent crusades would be called, but they would lack the moral authority and the popular support that had characterized the earlier crusades. The Fourth Crusade had revealed that religious conviction could be corrupted by economic interest, that sacred missions could be redirected toward profane objectives, that faith could be subordinated to greed. The transformation of the Crusade from a religious mission into an instrument of Venetian commercial policy revealed something fundamental about the nature of power in the medieval world. Economic power, in the form of control over maritime transport and commercial networks, had proven to be more decisive than military power or religious conviction. Venice, a city without a large standing army, had been able to redirect an entire crusade toward objectives that served Venice's commercial interests. The Crusaders, despite their military skill and their religious conviction, had found themselves unable to resist the pressure created by their economic dependence on Venice. This pattern would be repeated throughout subsequent medieval and early modern history. Economic power would prove to be a more reliable and more effective form of power than military might or religious authority. Cities and states that controlled trade routes and commercial networks would accumulate wealth and power far more rapidly than those that relied primarily on military conquest. Venice's dominance of Mediterranean commerce in the centuries following the Fourth Crusade would make it one of the great powers of Europe, rivaling kingdoms far larger and far more populous than the small lagoon city. The Fourth Crusade demonstrated that debt could be a weapon more powerful than any military force. Venice had created a debt through the contract of 1201. This debt had given Venice leverage over the Crusade. The Crusaders, unable to pay the debt, had found themselves forced to undertake actions they would not have chosen freely. They had attacked fellow Christians. They had conquered a Christian city. They had plundered sacred sites. They had transformed themselves from religious warriors into mercenary soldiers. All of this had occurred not because of military coercion, but because of financial pressure created by the debt they owed to Venice. The legacy of the Fourth Crusade extended far beyond the immediate political and commercial consequences of the conquest of Constantinople. The Crusade revealed the vulnerability of religious conviction to economic pressure. It demonstrated that sacred missions could be corrupted by commercial interests. It showed that warriors of faith could be transformed into instruments of commercial policy. It revealed that the machinery of organized religion and organized warfare could be captured and repurposed by those who controlled its material foundations. The centuries following the Fourth Crusade would see Venice consolidate and expand its commercial empire. The city would establish trading posts and commercial networks throughout the Mediterranean and beyond. Venetian merchants would dominate the trade between Europe and the East. Venetian wealth would accumulate. Venetian power would grow. The conquest of Constantinople would prove to be the foundation upon which Venice's subsequent dominance of Mediterranean commerce would rest. Yet Venice's dominance would not last forever. By the 16th century, new maritime powers would emerge. The Portuguese would establish sea routes around Africa to the Indian Ocean, bypassing the Mediterranean entirely. The Spanish would conquer vast territories in the Americas, generating wealth that would rival Venice's commercial profits. The Ottoman Empire would consolidate its control of the Eastern Mediterranean, restricting Venetian commercial activities. Venice's period of dominance would gradually decline. Yet the city's wealth and power in the centuries following the Fourth Crusade would remain unmatched by any other Mediterranean power. The conquest of Constantinople in 1204 marked a turning point in Mediterranean history. The Byzantine Empire, which had endured for nearly 9 centuries, was shattered. The Latin Empire that replaced it proved to be far less stable and far less capable. The Orthodox Church, which had maintained its independence from Rome, found itself subordinated to Catholic authority. The balance of power in the Eastern Mediterranean shifted decisively. Venice emerged as the dominant commercial power. The Ottoman Turks, encountering a fragmented and weakened Christian world, were able to expand their power far more rapidly than they might have otherwise. All of this flowed from the decision made in 1201 when Venice and the Crusade negotiated the contract for maritime transport. The debt created through that contract had set in motion a chain of events that would reshape the Mediterranean world. The Crusaders, believing themselves to be embarking on a sacred mission to reclaim the Holy Land, had instead become instruments through which Venice would reshape the Eastern Mediterranean to serve Venice's commercial interests. The currents of history, set in motion by economic calculation and financial leverage, had carried them to a destination they had not chosen and would not have chosen had they understood what awaited them. The Fourth Crusade stands as a singular moment in history when economic leverage reshaped the trajectory of civilizations. What began as a religious mission to reclaim sacred territory ended as an instrument of commercial conquest. The mechanism through which this transformation occurred, debt, financial dependency, and the systematic pressure that flows from owing more than one can repay, reveals something fundamental about how power operates in human societies. Money, it turns out, can redirect conviction more effectively than any military force. Debt can subordinate faith more thoroughly than any coercion. The consequences rippled across centuries. Constantinople, the greatest Christian city in the world, fell not to Muslim armies, but to Christian warriors whose actions had been redirected by financial obligation. The Byzantine Empire, guardian of Orthodox Christianity for nearly 9 centuries, fragmented under the weight of conquest and never recovered its former strength. The Ottoman Turks, encountering a weakened Christian world, expanded their power with accelerating momentum. The religious schism between Eastern and Western Christianity deepened irreparably. Venice emerged as the dominant Mediterranean power, its wealth and influence built on the foundation of this single conquest. Yet the Fourth Crusade offers a lesson that extends far beyond the medieval Mediterranean. It demonstrates that institutions, whether religious, military, or political, can be captured by those who control their material foundations. The Crusaders believed themselves to be autonomous agents executing a sacred mission. In reality, they were instruments of Venetian commercial policy, their actions determined not by conviction, but by financial necessity. They rationalized their compromises, convinced themselves of their righteousness, and proceeded toward destinations they had not chosen. Their story reveals how human beings justify moral corruption, how they subordinate principle to pragmatism, how they transform betrayal into necessity. The waters that had made Venice wealthy continued to carry commerce across the Mediterranean for centuries. Yet those same waters had carried the Crusaders toward Constantinople, toward plunder, toward the transformation of faith into profit. History does not move in straight lines toward redemption. It moves through currents set in motion by calculation and leverage, carrying civilizations toward destinations they did not anticipate and would not have chosen. The Fourth Crusade remains a monument to this truth, that economic interest, when sufficiently concentrated and strategically deployed, can reshape the sacred itself.